in the first place, kind of identifying with power, the prestige of power. So you're now, unlike your fellow whatever Zanzibaris, you are actually closer to the power, to the colonizers, to the Europeans, and so there's that prestige of power. Also modern, this is they're more civilized than we are, so I want to be like them. Sometimes people ask us things like, do you think literature can change the world? And I say, no, that's not what it can do. What it can do is, again, change us or make us understand things. Then it's us who can change the world, not that you can write a book that is going to change anything. It's how we receive the literature. But of course, I think literature is very important. It's important in a variety of ways. And that's its great beauty, that it's a variety of ways. It's important because it gives us pleasure and delights us as we read something, like listening to music, like reading. There's that kind of pleasure, the aesthetic pleasure, just simply admiring the way something is done and feeling pleased about that. It tells us things we already know, and we think, yes, I know that. That's true, because I feel like that too. So it kind of, in a way, it sort of endorses our own understanding, because we think, yes, oh gosh, that is exactly how I feel about this. But also it tells us about things we don't know. So it brings us news. It tells us about places and about people. It reassures us about them as well, because paradoxically, sometimes expresses also our prejudices. Silence itself is a profound, or can be a profound form of resistance, a profound form of, I suppose, of self-protection. So even not speaking can be provocative to the person trying to control. I mean, there are many examples of this, of course, in literature, how silence can be this powerful defense of the powerless. Because if you don't have the means to either strike back or the stories or the support in terms of a community or something like that, then silence is one of the ways in which you can say, okay, but I'm not playing.
Dear all, welcome to another episode of the Nature of the Future series of conversations. My name is Grzegorz Jankowicz. I'm a program director of the Conrad Festival. For these interviews, I invite writers, I admire writers from whom I think we can all learn something important about the present and the future. My interviewee today is Abdulrazak Gurnah, last year's Nobel Prize laureate, born in Zanzibar, but living and writing in England. Hello, Abdulrazak.
Hello there. Hi.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. I would like to talk to you about identity, which is one of the most important themes of your work, and which does not cease to be a key issue for all of us. All the questions I have for you will, so to say, emerge from your work. So let me get immediately into it.
Okay.
In your first work, Memory of Departure, there is a scene in which the people delegated by the new authority to keep order demand that the family of the main character, Hassan, show documents. Hassan, a teenager who is just entering adulthood, is disturbed because he lied about his race at the office when he realized that he had to provide an information about it. You present the moment when the protagonist's identity is no longer transparent, nor to him, neither to all people around him. What has changed in the society to which Hassan belongs, that this kind of question, the question about identity, the question about race, starts to determine life?
During the period of decolonization, that's to say, for our part of the world, say 1950s and early 1960s, one of the things that was important to many of us was to refuse to answer the question about race, because it was a question that was there in the colonial documents. If you apply for a passport, for example, or if you're registering somebody for school, one of the questions was race. So as a way of resisting this racialization of the society, people refused to answer this question. They would leave that part of the form blank. After the uprising, the revolution in 1964, because politics was racialized, that question was brought back. Because now race was being used as a way of making quotas. How many people of this race will be allowed to go to school? How many people of this race will be allowed to have jobs, etc. And then there was also a drive to register everybody for an ID card, which wasn't something that was there before. But this was part of the kind of the authoritarian nature of the new government. So everybody had to register for an ID card. So I think I wasn't the only one, but people gave false names, or they gave a false, particularly young people, or refused to answer the question about race, little realizing that this was making trouble for later on. Because everywhere you went after that, you have to show your ID card, and it's got a false name, or it has incomplete information, or. But that was the kind of source of what it is that Hassan does. It's a kind of an act of resistance at being racialized.
You know, the question of identity is transparent in the center of, so to say, empire, where the privileged ones do not have to wonder who they are, because the imperial mechanism answered the question for them. Is such a situation even possible in what is called a periphery? It seems that today, more people than ever cannot escape from that kind of questions, the questions about identity, the questions about race.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's really a matter of power. So the powerful are always the normative. They don't say, who am I? They know who I am, because they're the powerful ones. They ask of others to identify themselves, because the others are the ones who are different. So the questions like that, if they're being asked, they're usually being asked by powerful, prosperous societies, of those, as you say, on the periphery, or those who are seeking entrance into this, whether through class or through ethnic origin, or just simply geographical origin. So you wouldn't ask that question, or rather the person asking that question doesn't need to ask him or herself that question, because, well, it's obvious, isn't it? So you're quite right in saying that there is this kind of a differential, I suppose, power relationship between the normative and those who have to identify themselves.
Although Hassan comes from a rather poor family, he belongs to a group that is seen in Zanzibar as historically privileged. But nothing is obvious in your novel, which actually makes it so good. Those who once ruled become the victims. The former subalterns are responsible for the persecution, still being subaltern. This complexity can be captured and expressed by literature. But in public debate, it is usually simplified. For example, in Poland, we have a huge problem with such simplifications. What does it look like in Zanzibar? Is there room for such ambiguity in public debate today?
Increasingly so. So in the immediate aftermath of the overthrow of the post-independence government, which only lasted for a month. In the immediate aftermath, there was perhaps a great deal of pressure and a great deal of making difference. You are on this side, the other one's on that side. In other words, there was both the politics of Zanzibar, but also the history of Zanzibar became racialized. And everything was seen through these paradigms. But it grew less and less as the decades passed. That was 50 years ago. So now there is, exactly as you say, a more open debate, not fully open, not so that you can speak fully about these things that we're discussing here, but there is a conversation going on, sometimes in a muted way, sometimes in private spaces, with quite important people. Even the senior members of the government themselves speak about these things, even if they're not able to speak about them publicly, but they are speaking about these things. So I think, there is a gradual transformation away from that authoritarian mindset that followed immediately after the revolution.
Hassan is a very smart young man, but his consciousness is not yet fully formed. A certain naivety is evident in his approach to migration. In a letter to his beloved cousin, he presents his journey in a very ecstatic way. And when I thought about it, it came to my mind that idealistic image of traveling to the center of the colonial world was part of the colonial education. And it looks like Hassan cannot fully free himself from this influence. Can he?
No, he can't. But in a way, we don't know where he's going. Nor does he. The earlier discussion in the novel suggests that he might go to England, but that wasn't his idea. That was other people's ideas. He says, so you could go there, you could become and then he starts daydreaming. You could become a doctor, you could do this. So all these ambitions and all these destinations are indeed part of being colonized. But it isn't just colonialism that does that. Once again, it's power that does that. The prestige of power that says, the place to go if you really are ambitious is Beijing or wherever, New York, London, etc. And I think these sorts of ways of thinking, this mythicizing of other places, is both an expression of the deprivation of where you live and how you live, but it's also a kind of fantasy land. And what drives all these young people you see risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean is something similar too. It isn't just simply a desire for prosperity. It is to escape something as well. It's to escape deprivation, to escape being boxed in ambition. That's what it is. And that ambition often works as a fantasy rather than reality. And everybody sooner or later discovers that.
In your second novel, titled Pilgrim's Way, you tell the story of a migrant, Dawood, who struggles for his identity. He lives in England, but the process of his incorporation into Britain's society is constantly being undermined by someone. What is the reason of it? Why this process cannot be fully realized, neither by him nor by the society?
Well, partly is what he already has. He himself is. He's a stranger. A stranger brings a lot of things with him or her from wherever it was that he came from. So partly one of the obstacles is that he is who he is, and he cannot just shrug and insert himself into this new place. And that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that he's not a welcome stranger. So there is resistance from the other side to his, shall we say, his entrance or participation in this. And what he realizes is that fact, there is already a very complicated narrative about who he is. That the people there see him, look at him, and see him in a way that is already kind of complete. Doesn't matter what he is or what he says or what he does. And so he then, as a defense, he then sees them equally in this homogenized way as somehow representing colonialism or the empire or all the stories that they were feeding him when he was young or at school or whatever. And so he makes a kind of comedy out of that. So he sees everybody as, you know, in terms of a historical moment in empire. And it's a defense, it's a way of defending himself from what he perceives to be misrepresentation, or at least a representation that is diminishing, that makes him small. And so his defense is to laugh at them in his own way.
He copes with this experience, copes with this violence that is directed at him by writing imaginary letters in which he expresses his feelings and thoughts about those who give him hard time in England. Writing, which avoids direct confrontation, helps him in various ways. What does he gain from it? What does he gain from writing these fictional letters?
Well, he gains, he hits back. As you say, it's not that he hits back to people's faces. He hits back, and this gives him some satisfaction. I remember hearing my elders, even my mother even, describing an unsettling encounter with somebody, and then saying, I almost said, but I didn't. So it's that, or Flaubert has this, what he calls stare wit. That is to say, you've had an encounter with somebody, you leave the room, and as you're going down the stairs, you answer them in your mind, but you couldn't do it to their face. So the letters are that kind of thing. I almost said, but then I can't because I'm frightened, or I'm afraid to be embarrassed or something like that, but I can do it in my mind. So that's what those letters do. They make him feel better.
This is a good moment to ask you about your attitude towards literature. If we discuss writing, that kind of question is legitimate. In one interview, when asked about the power of literature, you were rather skeptical. You answered that it does not help us in a way we tend to believe it does. How do you feel about the power of literature? What can we gain from writing, from reading literature when we are like Dawood, lost in a place that does not accept us, in a situation we have to solve?
I doubt very much that I said that literature does not help. It depends how the question was formulated. It may be, sometimes people ask us things like, do you think literature can change the world? And I say, no, that's not what it can do. What it can do is, again, change us or make us understand things. Then it's us who can change the world, not that you can write a book that is going to change anything. It's how we receive the literature. But of course, I think literature is very important. It's important in a variety of ways. And that's its great beauty, that it's a variety of ways. It's important because it gives us pleasure and delights us as we read something, like listening to music, like reading. There's that kind of pleasure, the aesthetic pleasure, just simply admiring the way something is done and feeling pleased about that. It tells us things we already know, and we think, yes, I know that, that's true, because I feel like that too. So it kind of, in a way, it sort of endorses our own understanding, because we think, yes, oh gosh, that is exactly how I feel about this. But also it tells us about things we don't know. So it brings us news. It tells us about places and about people. it reassures us about them as well, because paradoxically, sometimes expresses also our prejudices. Because I remember the reference of Goethe reading a Chinese novel when he was just getting interested in the idea of world literature, and saying or writing to a friend and saying, after reading this novel, "Oh my God, they're just like us." He's surprised, because obviously, to his mind, Chinese are nothing like us. But he reads that and he says, they're just like us. So literature does all of these things. What it doesn't do is it doesn't do the job for us. It doesn't change the world for us or something like
that. Well, to be precise, the question was about if literature can help us with the feeling of homelessness. Can this feeling be erased by literature, by writing the story, or by reading a story about similar experience? And you said that it will not help with homelessness because it just cannot reach this part of us that was determined by circumstances. It can only inspire us to do something on our own to solve the problem.
Well, kind of. That's more or less what I've also just been saying, that it may make us see and recognize something that we didn't recognize before, or even just reassure us that it is as I thought it was. But then it's up to us to think about, what do I do about it?
The beginnings of your writing were all about, so to say, sorting out experiences after leaving Zanzibar and arriving in Britain. At what point did these notes, originally made only for yourself, begin to evolve into consciously created literature?
Yeah, I guess slowly. But I think maybe when I found myself fictionalizing those, that is to say, making a story out of it with somebody else who might be a little bit like me, but not exactly. So that generates a little bit of freedom. You can change things. It doesn't have to be exactly true to you or to your experience. I think it was around about then I found myself writing little episodes, not a novel. And it's only after a while that I thought, I wonder if I could write a complete story out of this. And as that grows, and I think, I wonder if I could, do you think this could be a novel maybe? So it slowly came along. I didn't at some point sit and say, I'm going to write a novel. But the writing was accumulating. And then I thought, right, what's the best way of shaping this? How to organize this? And that's writing. When a person begins to think not just about writing down reflections or writing down things that are bothersome, but are actually shaping it, organizing it, and then you have something crafted, something made, rather than just simply a kind of confiding your thoughts to your book or journal or computer or whatever. I think when that happened, then in a way, I think when you start on something like that, then you become hooked. You have to see if you can do it properly. I would imagine, like an athlete, if you discover you have a certain talent and you have to keep training because you want to improve, you want to compete, well, of course, writing is not competitive in that way, but then it becomes important to see it through, to actually make a good try at doing it. And sometimes, as it happened, it took a few years. It takes many people sometimes a long time to actually complete the work, to get published, to get some kind of recognition in terms of reception and so on. And for some people, it never comes. So you just keep going. But I think once you start, it's very difficult until you give it a really good attempt to say, no. There are moments, I know in my experience, there are moments I think, am I wasting my time as you're kind of struggling or waiting to be published. And it's not just my time, my family's time. Don't disturb him, he's working, that kind of thing. So everybody has to make these decisions for themselves. And as I know that some people just in the end think, no, it's not going to happen, and give up. And some people don't, forever.
The protagonist of your fifth novel, Admiring Silence, is also a migrant from Zanzibar. He came to England in the 60s and leads stabilized but very passive life. At the beginning of the novel, he comes to a doctor with chest pains. And it's actually exactly the situation you described earlier, when someone almost said something in response to a comment. In a racist comment, the doctor attributes a Caribbean identity to him, claiming that Afro-Caribbeans are particularly prone to heart disease. And here is what the protagonist thinks about these comment. Of course, after all this drama, I did not have the heart to tell him that I was not Afro-Caribbean or any kind of Caribbean, not even anything to do with the Atlantic. Strictly an Indian Ocean lad, Muslim, Orthodox Sunni by upbringing, Wahhabi by association, and still unable to escape the consequences of those early constructions. What is the reason for this nameless character passive attitude? Is it somehow related to the fact that he cannot break away from what he calls early constructions while living in England, where he should reinterpret his identity?
I don't think he's passive, because even just the passage that we just read, you can see he's refusing a certain way of being seen. He understands that in England, almost anybody who's dark skinned, or at least at that period, anyway, things have changed a little bit, that anybody who's dark skinned at a certain time, particularly in a big city, or in London, would be described as Afro-Caribbean. So in a way, it's a kind of laziness of the host community that sees people as either Asian or Afro-Caribbean. Now they can, of course, because there's so many other Syrians, there are Middle Eastern people, and so on. So that question now has become more complicated. But for a while, people could quietly and simplify the whole issue by saying British Asian, Afro-Caribbean, or Black British or something like that. So it's that he's refusing. But I don't see that as passivity. I see that as a way of resisting a certain way of being represented, and saying, even if it's only to himself, or to you as the reader, think about that. Not everybody is Afro-Caribbean. Actually, the people have much more complex beginnings, or if you like, identities, than these big blocks that it becomes possible for a kind of a lazy host community, as it were, to use and to operate. So I don't think he's passive. I think especially the language that his thoughts and his thinking are, resisting all the time, resisting all sorts of things, inventing, lying, whatever. That's not passivity. It seems to me, telling lies and making up a life, and that this is a way of refusing a certain narrative.
What I mean by passivity in his context is that he does not show it off. It's like a long monologue that is expressed by him inside. He constantly refers to situations in which he is trapped and he opposes it. That's for sure. But it's like his inner work, and in contact with the world, in contact with other people, he refuses to openly express it, to reject this oppressiveness by open statements towards them. That's why I thought about passivity. But of course, you're absolutely right that a lot of things happen in his mind. He talks to himself all the time, commenting upon what's going on around him.
Yeah, that's why the novel is called Admiring Silence. It's because silence itself is a profound, or can be a profound form of resistance, a profound form of, I suppose, of self-protection. So even not speaking can be provocative to the person trying to control. I mean, there are many examples of this, of course, in literature. How silence can be this powerful defense of the powerless, because if you don't have the means to either strike back or the stories or the support in terms of a community or something like that, then silence is one of the ways in which you can say, okay, but I'm not playing.
One of my favorite novels by you is Dottie. The title, protagonist's mother, a migrant, escaped from her family home to avoid arranged marriage. It was an act of rebellion against the patriarchal social structure and, of course, her father. But her life in England turned out badly, trying to forget the past, but also ashamed of her situation. She decided to cut her children off from the past and not tell them about the family or culture she once belonged to. Dottie, one of the three children, must build her identity almost from nothing. Literally, she has almost nothing except a picture to start with. It's a very difficult situation. How did you come up with this idea?
Well, it's not uncommon. Both in my own experience, I mean, my own experience in that people I knew or met or whatever who went through this. But as it happened at the time when I was writing Dottie, I was actually working in a voluntary organization that was, well, voluntary in the sense that it wasn't state run, whose work was to actually kind of like to bring people who had messed up their education, who had dropped out from school or something like that, to reintroduce them into the educational system by providing a kind of what's called access course. I don't know if you have those kinds of things. So they're like an intense 12-week program in which, you know, like I say, people who dropped out of school but want to continue to return to studying. So a 12-week intense period of, you know, basically training them to the basics, English, maths, some kind of liberal study stuff, and then they can go back to college and continue studying. The majority of the people joining this program were Black people, young Black people who somehow things hadn't worked out. And so several of the stories that they told would be about how parents or circumstances, if not deliberately parents, but maybe circumstances because the parents are working too hard, or the single parent or something like that, that they feel adrift in this way. They don't know their stories. They don't know their grandparents' stories or whatever, this kind of. So I found I was hearing stories like that from these young people. Soon after that, I started teaching at the University of Kent. And one of the courses that I taught was a course on the experience of migration. I kind of made this up. I wasn't given this course. This is a course I myself wanted to teach. So I read a great deal about experiences of migrant families, and mostly on the UK. So it's mostly about Britain. So I can tell you for sure that this is not an uncommon thing. And then finally, I'll give you one more example, which is also something that I was thinking of when I was writing The Last Gift. Sometime around about the year 2007, there were several events, but connected events. So 3, I think, young people of migrant origin basically blew themselves up as suicide bombers. One on a bus in London, one in an underground station, and I think one in the streets. And these people had come from a different part of the UK to London deliberately with backpacks full of bombs to commit suicide and to kill people. And they killed several people and themselves. And as was the fashion at the time, one of them had made a video before. You know, sometimes suicide bombers would make a video as a kind of their statement. Why am I doing this? And I saw this. It was shown on the news, or a clip of it was shown on the news. And it was very passionate and quite eloquent. And his explanation for doing this was that he was brought up by his parents. I should say that he was quite probably of Pakistani origin, the parents, Muslim. He was brought up by his parents in a secular fashion. And as he grew older, he realized that, or as he thought of it, he realized that something had been stolen from him. He'd been denied something that he thought belonged to him. And his parents' explanation would almost certainly have been that by bringing him up in a secular fashion, they were going to make it a little easier for him to get on, as it were, in the social climate of the United Kingdom. But he saw it as something he'd been denied. And in his rediscovery of his tradition or his sense of belonging, he became a suicide bomber, which sounds absolutely ironic and mad. But what I'm saying is that this is not an uncommon thing, this sense of people being either deliberately brought up to forget the past, or simply because the parents are in dire straits and they want to reject their past for one reason or another, as in the case of Dottie's mother. But one can imagine many other kinds of scenarios as well, where knowledge of the past is, for migrant people, for people who've dislocated. Because there isn't somebody else there to say, your father was like this, or your grandfather was like that. There isn't that community to keep refreshing the stories of your connections. There's only your parents say, or your single parent say. And she or he might, for various reasons, be in denial, as the Americans say, over this, or might simply be too busy or too oppressed to actually provide that kind of context. So that was my thinking about people like that family. And then the whole point, of course, is that I think of it, one of the resources, one of the great resources of us human beings, is this, many of us anyway, this capacity to retrieve something from traumatic events or traumatic experiences. And that's what Dottie does. So that story is really about that.
The activity of changing or giving or interpreting names plays a very important role in this novel. What is this work with names all about? The mother of Dottie she changes her name. Then Dottie thinks about all her names, trying to create stories referring, touching upon all the names she was given by her mother. What's the story behind this work with names in your novel?
Well, there are many things about names. The very fact that she becomes Dottie, which is an abbreviation, which is in a sense a forced name. She would rather have all those Dottie Badura Fatma 4, but she becomes Dottie. The same way that people coming to this country anyway, and I'm sure the same would be wherever you go. What's your name? You'll become George, whether you want to or not. You'll become George, and you might say, "Well, actually, I'm not." You know, I know because I have a name like that, which people almost always want to shorten. Is there a version of your name which is just 2 syllables? Do we have to say 4 syllables? This kind of thing. So it's, and wanting to insist on names or even inventing new ones is, I think, a way of resisting this kind of homogenizing desire as well. So to simplify you, to make you more recognizably somebody part of this, or at least accessible. And sometimes people, I think names are a very good way of demonstrating contentment or discontent. Sometimes people don't like their names, and they don't like their names because of an association with another place. So, like in By the Sea, the thief Mahmoud doesn't like his name, so he changes it to something that he likes. It's one of the small benefits of migrating, is that you can make small reinventions if you want. Not always desirable, because it's an expression of fantasy in some ways to say, well, I'm not that, I'm this. But it's an act of self-possession. I'm going to change my name to something I like. So there are many different ways in which naming and names and so on can be delicate ways of hinting at a frame of mind as well, ways of hinting how a person feels about themselves. Or sometimes it's just simply a way of saying, I am a foreigner. I don't want to be like you, I'm a foreigner. So it's a way of kind of being stubborn about who you are.
I guess my name in English in Britain would be Greg, abbreviated as Greg, because Grzegorz is Gregory, and George is Jerzy. It's not important. I just.
But in any case, you may not have had any choice.
Sure, I understand what you mean.
Yeah, sure.
Has any reader, after reading Dottie, but without this experience of migration, shared with you that he or she had to start from scratch, creating their subjectivity and identity? I mean, it's obvious that people who comes from families that migrated to certain places, they could have such experiences. But it was really surprising for me that my students, when I talked to them about Dottie, they did not have that kind of experiences. But after reading the novel, they would openly confess several times that this is a story about them, about their experience. Maybe not as dramatic, but still. Has anyone shared such story with you after reading your novel?
No, that's incredible. Not quite like that. I mean, people have spoken about how how much they were engaged by the story, but nobody has said that. I would have been very interested to hear that conversation, to say, tell me your story then. How does this story overlap with yours? But this is probably, I mean, I'm very pleased to hear that, because this is what I was saying earlier on about literature, that writing does that, where you think, for reasons that might seem really, really far-fetched, I feel like that I could be reading Anna Karenina or something like that. I think, well, what's Anna Karenina got to do with me? But it is, and the places where, without perhaps even, I'm talking about reading it in an innocent way, not reading it as a scholar, but reading it as a, say, a young person, and it just touches something that you don't even, completely unexpected. You may not even be fully understanding what you're reading, but still it reaches there somewhere.
Discussions about Paradise, one of your best-known novels, concern many of the themes that appear in it. I, for one, would like to ask you, in the context of this work, of this novel, about a certain figure that recurs several times in your work, the uncle, who plays the role of the superior of the family or even the community, and sometimes turns out to be the embodiment of oppressiveness. In Paradise, this uncle is Aziz, to whom the main character, Yusuf, is sold by his father to repay the debt. Why is this figure so interesting to you?
Well, in the first place, the uncle title is a term of respect. So in the first place, is that. So you wouldn't say of somebody who's either an adult or that you want to show respect to, but not in a kind of groveling way. You would address them as uncle, or you'd speak about them as uncle so and so. So in the first place, is that it's just a term of respect, and then certainly in the part of the world I come from, we're very generous with how we speak about relations. So a cousin will be described as a brother. A relative of some kind will be an uncle or an aunt, and so on. So, and somebody a little older will be a grandfather, even if they're not really grandfather. So in this way, there is a sense in which, as I say, we're generous about who we call our relatives. But in the case of Paradise, the uncle, and perhaps elsewhere too, the uncle figure is often the patriarch. So not necessarily the most, the eldest or anything like that, but probably the most powerful person within either a family or a community or something like that. And so in the case of Paradise, Uncle Aziz is not really an uncle, and that's what Khalil keeps saying to him. But in a way, he has to be called uncle. What else can he be called? Because there is no other term that would indicate that same respect that I've spoken.
Polish readers receive your latest novel, Afterlives, first. There is an extremely moving story of one Ilias in it. Ilias is raised in East Africa at the beginning of 20th century in the spirit of German culture, and later he fights on the German side, becoming a defender of the ideology that oppresses and ultimately destroys him. I won't reveal what happens to him at the very end, but how is it possible that the oppressed does not see the destructive influence of the oppressor, or perhaps he does perceive it, he does see it, but for some reason he prefers such an existence.
Well, it's a well-known phenomenon of people who become. It could be a result of colonialism. It could be a result of other kinds of oppressions, if you like, or being taken over. That become Anglophile to the extent that they dress in the same way as the English, say, even during colonial periods. Maybe they even furnish their houses in the same way, try to imitate the way they do things. And the reason for this would be, I would have thought, in the first place, kind of identifying power, the prestige of power. So you're now, unlike your fellow whatever Zanzibaris, you are actually closer to the power, to the colonizers, to the Europeans. And so there's that prestige of power. Also modern, this is they're more civilized than we are. So, I want to be like them. There would be, in the case of Ilyas, you may recall that he's also protected by a German settler. He's educated in a German school. He loves German songs. And so there is also an element of choice in a way that he's attracted to the German way of doing things. All those sorts of things, and maybe even a little bit of adventure and excitement to get away from, the kind of the difficult life that he had, although he was only a small boy. But and then he enters this other life which broadens him and gives him, something new, a new perspective on everything, and kindness. He believes he doesn't. People keep telling him in the novel that there's all this violence and these people are responsible for that, but he sticks to what he knows. You don't know these people. They're kind. They're not like that, etc. So in a way, you could see it as a kind of the triumph of colonialism is to some extent not only to take over people's lives in a physical sense, but also to take over their minds and to persuade them that not to see what they can see, to see things differently, to see things their way.
There is another Ilyas in this novel who got his name after the earlier one. The second Ilyas is a journalist, and he works with archives. He can, so to say, weave a story about the entanglement that became a trap for his uncle. Here again, we have an example of the positive impact of stories that capture the complicated fates of people caught up in history. Was it done on purpose to show how important the work with archives is for our understanding of the past and for the process of identity creation?
Well, archives come in different forms, don't they? So in this case, archives can be oral. It can be passed on in that way. In this case, this is a hidden story. Ilyas has disappeared and nobody has heard from him. One presumes, we don't know if he's alive even, and then we discover that he was for a long time alive, but that he chose not to reveal himself. And that would be an interesting thing to speculate on. Why did he choose to do this? Why did he choose to keep quiet? But I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to speculate on that. I'm going to leave that where it is. So there was only really one way of finding out, which is to actually go to Germany and track him down. And in a way, the story is quite a painful one and a difficult one. And, because he's a journalist, you can see there must have been some delight in tracking, following these different routes. And so archive searches can not only be about revealing identity, it can be a kind of an aesthetic experience in itself, to to see how you can go from one clue to another and another and another. An intellectual event in a sense. But it also means that I could speak about that whole experience of National Socialists, particularly, but not only them, desire for recolonization, to go back as if this is something that belonged to them that we take away, rather than them dealing with societies that have a right to be themselves.
So finally, I have a question about the title of the last novel. It is not easy to translate it into Polish. The literal translation sounds very bad in Polish. Afterlives means lives after death. But it occurred to me that this title could be understood differently. To go after lives. And that would be the purpose of literature, the purpose of your stories. To catch by means of a story a life that is entangled in historical, social, or political processes and protect this life or save it or redeem it. Does it make any sense to you?
Yes, it makes sense. It makes sense. It's always nice to hear people offering a different version of something you had sort of thought of, maybe differently. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that I do admire, I do write about regularly in several books, like Dottie is an example of how people retrieve something from traumatic experiences. In this case, in my thinking, Afterlives referred to several things, but also to the way in which the two central figures, Hamza and Afia, are able to retrieve themselves, to find each other, to find affection, to find a new life, to have a second life, in a way, from the life that was, in the case of Hamza, injured, war experience, traumatized by that. But now he's found something more stable, he's found happiness, and he's found love. So Afterlives, because it's a second life after the first one. But I'll take yours as well.
Dear Abdulrazak, thank you for the conversation. It was really a great experience for me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that too.
Let me give one information. Let me give one information to the audience. Dear all, next episode of The Nature of the Future will be released on the last Thursday of October, and my interviewee will be Colm Toibin. Be with us, be with Conrad Festival. Abdulrazak, I owe you a great deal of thanks.
Thank you very much.